All right, everyone, welcome to the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. My name is Anthony Costello. I am here with Jacob Daniel,
Hey,
Logan Zeppieri, and Josh Matayka. Gentlemen, how are we tonight?
Great.
Good. All right. Well, we are still dealing with the ever-present topic of critical race theory, both in the culture more broadly and now in the church. Maybe even more specifically now in two major evangelical institutions, the Southern Baptist Convention, of which has been much in the news lately, and also the CCCU, which, Jacob, again, remind me what CCCU stands for our audience.
Council of Christian Colleges and Universities.
Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, where CRT also seems to be, if not sort of taking over, at least getting more and more popular. As maybe a view through which theology is going to be taught at some Christian colleges and universities. So, Logan, we wanted to frame this in a simple question, but that might have various answers. And that question is going to be, is critical race theory a blind theory? So why don't you start us off with maybe what we mean by that question and a couple initial reflections.
Yeah, I think this question is to respond to, I think, a gap in the conversation. When you talk to a lot of CRT advocates, if you read some of the CRT scholars, the main argument has been something like, without CRT, certain problems or difficulties or even like social hurdles kind of drop out of the picture. And an example of what this means, of dropping out of the picture, is an exercise I used to do with when I did a bunch of leadership programs. And one of the things I would tell some of the students or even some of the coworkers is that part of being a good leader is you have to be able to help those around you identify certain problems or certain trends within maybe an organization that are normally unseen. And so I would tell them, hey, go into this room, find all the green objects, come out and tell me, memorize them, come and tell me. So it'd go in, take about 5 minutes, it'd come out. They would recite all the green objects. I said, okay, can you name like one red object? And sometimes they would get one or two, but vastly, they would miss a ton of them. Mm-hmm. And the point being is, it seems like if you're not aware, certain things drop off. CRT advocates tend to make the same argument about racism. If you don't have a racialized society or you don't take in racialized factors, then all the racial problems drop out of the picture. However, it seems like CRT, in adopting a racialized society, will become blinded to other fundamental facts about the world. In other words, they're saying, look at all the red objects. The question is, but are the green objects important? And I think a good conversation about what CRT brings about and what other competing, I guess, fundamental worldviews also bring about.
That's it's a good analogy. It's a good thought experiment that you did with your students. I remember we had to do something like this in the military, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen this video of the guys passing a basketball back and forth to each other, and you're told to count how many times. There's like a team with like white shirts and a team with like black shirts or something. And you're told to count how many times the team in the white shirts have passed the ball, and everybody's sitting there and you're focusing so much on trying to see how many times, and they're running around. So it gets very confusing. And midway through the video, and very few people catch this, but midway through the video, this guy in a gorilla suit walks right through the screen. And the question at the end is, did you notice the guy in the gorilla suit walking through the screen? And most of the time people are like, no, I had no idea. So in a similar sense, Logan, I guess what you're saying is, if we I mean, CRT is saying we have to adopt CRT, otherwise we won't see these things. But
Mhm.
then,
Very much the same way.
the
Yeah.
same thing would work in reverse. Once CRT is adopted and everything is seen through the lens of race or racialized society, well, then other factors that are important to maybe alleviating social ills that are real may drop out. And then we're not offering really complete solutions to the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, let me see if I can provide one of the things that's kind of on the blind spot and what we are missing. But before I do that, I'm sure our listeners might be wondering as to why we are still engaging with this idea of critical race theory. One of the things I would say is that it seems like critical theory is evolving in terms of how it is being adopted within the church itself. Now there's a conversation going on as to this could be a tool for evangelism. People are even talking about that. So for us to understand that there are these blind spots that would basically impede us from obeying the scriptures, obeying the commission that we have as it should be. So one of the things that I think, and please correct me in this, is that there is, because of CRT and because we have adopted this one property on the basis of which we are defining all aspects of life, we are abandoning a biblical principle of justice, which is mostly restorative justice. And there is an overemphasis on distributive justice at the expense of restorative justice. So with regards to CRT, that's one of the areas, because there is no talk of forgiveness. There is no talk of reconciliation on the basis of forgiveness, on the basis of Christian principles that we hold to so much. So I think with too much emphasis on distributive justice, on the basis of, again, a one property of who we are abandoning the rest of the things that makes us beings made in the image of God. So that's one thing that I would put forward as to something that's kind of like being CRT is blinded to.
Well, and I
And-
think that's important what you
Yeah.
just said, Jacob, is at the expense of.
Yeah.
Retributive justice, restorative justice, distributive justice, all those sorts of things are important. And in any functioning judicial system, you're going to have all elements.
Mhm.
But it's when one form is being adopted at the expense of another, that it becomes a problem. So I just wanted to emphasize that it's this at the expense of that's becoming such a problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
And I think that's where you get two different camps as well in CRT. This is especially the difference that I notice between just generally CRT advocates in the church and CRT advocates outside of it. A lot of times people will try to adopt CRT, wholesale, like as a worldview, and to see the whole lens in which we see reality through CRT. And when that happens, I think there's this total, like you said, at the expense of some of these other things. But then I also noticed that there's some CRT advocates who want to, and this is where I think definitions are incredibly important, but almost nitpick what premises are we can take out of CRT, especially in the church. What can we use to maybe see a slice of reality that we otherwise wouldn't see, and then throw the rest out? So one common thing I hear is, chew the meat and spit out the bones. The only problem with that, though, is you can literally apply that to anything. I mean, you can apply that to Satanism. You technically, I mean, you could say because all evil is parasitic in nature, theologically, right? It has to rely on a bit of truth in order to exist. And so, like for example, even in Satanism, the bit of good in that is do as you desire. It doesn't sound too far different from Augustine, except it's completely outside the confines of Scripture. And we're enslaved to our desires under Satan. That's what you're not told. But so the key part there is there's always going to be some good or some truth in just about any theory. The question is the theory as a whole helpful or even consistent with Christianity? And I think that's what we would contest.
That's a good point, Josh, because to think that there'd be a couple problems. To think that it's easy to distill something that could be integrated into a biblical worldview. I mean, it took several hundred years before, and it took somebody like Augustine to sort of integrate Middle Platonism to some degree, or synthesize it with a Christian biblical view. Just as it took somebody like Aquinas to synthesize Aristotle to some degree. And we would have to say that those syntheses were not without their problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? They were not without their problems. They've been judged historically. And while we still maintain some of it, we've Luther, right? I mean, Luther got that. I forget what choice juicy names Luther had for Aristotle, but they weren't good ones. I feel like there's this desire, and I think it's just because of the modern culture we live in. And, I'm reading Carl Trueman's book right now, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he talks about Philip Reif's work. And then, of course, Charles Taylor as well, where, we're so modern in that we just want to jump into everything new. I think there's sort of an arrogance here that as Christians, we can easily synthesize these views with a biblical worldview, as opposed to sacrificing the biblical worldview to these other systems.
Well, you have with Aristotle,
yeah,
when he's talking about, I mean, just to give a simple example to maybe our audience, where he introduces this idea of kind of the golden mean between two extremes is kind of the virtuous path. But he is wise enough to say, well, it seems like there are certain things in of themselves that don't lend themselves to moderation or to a golden mean. Like how many people should you murder? Is it like, don't do 1,000, don't do 0, so do like 50 or something like that? He's going, no, you have to figure out where that instance lies on the spectrum for which that mean can be applied. So there has to be, murder has to be on a larger spectrum than just on itself. And so again, certain principles, like maybe like victimhood, Christianity or Aristotle might not have an understanding of a moderate victimhood mentality. It might just be that victimhood is something like murder as far as the moral dimensions.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is, and that's a problem in our culture, that we are failing to understand that there are no neutral position when it comes to any idea, even including justice, that concerns with morality. When we take even a position of being winsome and try to take a neutral position on matters like CRT, we are taking a position, and you're saying in the spectrum we should be, there is one way or the other we'll be leaning. There is no absolute neutral position on this, right? When we take CRT as a whole, not just nitpicking here and there, as you mentioned that. And one of the examples I always say, CRT, the issue with CRT is one of, it's not that we're talking about, we all agree that all truth is God's truth, right? Wherever it is found, but we're concerning with the truth, not any kind of syncretism with that which is not good, true, and beautiful.
Yeah.
But this is one of those things, it's like having food on the one side and then the poison on one side. You can't say that, right? The two should not be separated. We understand that it's just a little bit of poison in the food that you're about to have. That's going to kill you. It's not just the good side of the food that you want to partake in. And I think that's where the danger is.
That's good. I mean, right now, going back to Logan's question or point about if we adopt CRT, what other things drop out that all of a sudden we don't see? Because now everything has to fall in line with, and Jacob, you've made this point several times. You can't just, and Josh, you can't just look at the complexity of human life through one lens,
Well,
right? Through
well,
one factor.
yeah.
And this is where I think I would make the point that one thing that seems to me clearly to be dropping out when I listen to those who are moving to embrace critical race theory is any sense of the transcendent. This really, to me, places CRT, and it's really in the spirit of materialism. And Jacob, you mentioned distributive justice. And to me, what this looks like is we solve much of the human condition to include the problem of sin and the need for grace through the alteration and modification of material conditions on the ground. And once we get those material conditions set correctly, and that's all called neighbor love on the CRT worldview. That's how we love our neighbor now. Then once we set up those conditions properly, we've achieved what maybe, the Frankfurt School philosophers would have called some kind of liberation. Now, some of those Frankfurt School Marxians or Gramsci would have gone beyond just material goods. They would have pressed, obviously, into the realm of sexuality, which I've mentioned so many times because it's so obvious, as another sort of psychological, physical means to liberation. And why are people talk about being blind? Why are people blind to the fact that, at least in the world of CRT, the worldly sense of it, it's always connected with some kind of sexual movement towards liberation? It's not just race. It's always connected to the gender issue, to the marriage issue, and to the children issue.
Yeah.
Always.
And I think it's not that the scripture doesn't concern with systemic issues and problem. It does confront that as well. Yeah. But it doesn't do that at the expense of the fact that human nature is flawed inherently. And we need to be dealing with both simultaneously. And I think in the CRT conversation mostly, and people are not understanding this, then when people within the church adopt CRT, they somehow feel, I think there is a difference in the way people in the church understand CRT on the whole issue of human nature, whereas people outside the church, for them, human nature is inherently good. It is corrupted by the system. So you have to change the system and modify the system. But in the church, exactly, in the church, no one is talking about that. That's why there is no discussion around human nature as to how much we are inherently flawed to bring about evil in this world. Whereas we're questioning the system itself at the expense of having a discussion in terms of what human nature is. I think we have to have both discussions together, and I doubt if CRT would allow us to do that.
Well, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go, Josh. Go. You got it.
On that point, Jacob, you made a really good distinction that the way that the church is talking about CRT and almost the purpose in which CRT can be yielded, right, by CRT advocates in the church is different than those outside the church. Those outside the church want to apply CRT as a whole world view, and they're okay with many of the assumptions that are obviously incoherent with Christianity, such as that we're fundamentally good, or white people are inherently oppressive and therefore have guilt simply because they're white, that this ancestral guilt or this group based shaming. And so there's certain things like that where those are considered the bones that are being spitted out by the church. And let's hold on to this other part that we say is meat, which is, perhaps these marginalized people groups, or these certain things in which we've been oblivious, that America and the rest of the world has been oblivious to for the past, for all of history up until now. And see, the problem there is that even when we look at, okay, well, what are the specific claims? What are these specific? Because CRT, right, it does really focus in and narrow in on a couple key things. When we take a look at those specific key things, for example, systemic racism, or institutional, like whether you're talking about institutionalized in terms of the law and the legal structure, or you're talking about the cultural disposition of the majority of America, the very conversation around that tends to err away from truth. So, for example, I was just watching a couple of videos on this recently when we were looking through some of the videos on which to talk about on this video, and I came across a PragerU video. It was on it was I think is Brandon Tatum. He's an outspoken Christian conservative. He was an African American who used to be a cop, and now he talks about this a lot. And he quotes some statistics that were new. I actually looked this up. White people are 2 to 3 times as likely, unarmed white people are 2 to 3 times as likely to be shot by a police officer than an unarmed black man. Also, a black man is 18 times more likely to kill a police officer than a police officer is to kill an unarmed black man. And so when we're looking at, like, what are the reasons behind these things, and why are they this way? So, like, when he brought up the thing about there being 2 to 3 times as many white people that are unarmed white people that are killed, people on the streets, when he's interviewing, they're like, did you notice? They're like, no idea. So even the things that CRT focuses on and the conversations around that are ultimately, and maybe this is simplistic, but they're just lacking.
And for the sake of our audience, and this is not just concerning whites and people of color, even between people of color, right? I came across this statistics just today. One of the former safety network community organizers in San Francisco came out with the statistics of 85% of the physical assault crimes today against Asians is conducted by African Americans. But no one's talking about that. These facts don't matter at all, right? It comes down to selective or a favored minority. That's the term used, a favored minority, and we work with that. And that's an inherent flaw, I think, in this whole system.
Well, let me just jump in really quick. It's like a combination of what a few of you guys said. When Tony talks about losing, one of the things we lose is the transcendent. And Jacob, you started talking about things like human value, things like you started talking about like a privileged minority. But once you get the transcendent out of the picture, you lose things like human nature is the big part that we're focusing on, but nature's across the board. I think Chesterton talks about this. You just get one thing, which is just a flux of everything. So you lose natures, you lose any form of transcendent value. So with the Christian worldview, you at least get the Imago Dei, whether or not you accept it as true, the Christian religion, there's at least within its framework an appeal that each person has to the transcendent. Even the idea of evil no longer has a transcendent value. So it becomes very malleable. Who is valuable, who's not valuable, who's evil, who's not evil, is now just kind of in flux. This then gets into questions like, so we were talking about this before we started, but like with the transgender stuff in the sports, you have a question of, well, are there such things as biological natures? Do you have male and female? Well, if there's no appeal to the transcendent, then it's just flux. It's just hormones. And so there's no, I go on social media, I see people saying, oh, the transgender movement's just not, they're just ignoring biology. They're ignoring biology. It's not so much I think that they're ignoring it. I'm thinking that their worldview has sort of concluded prior to assessing biology that biology just isn't a factor to take into consideration. Just you have chemicals and it's on a kind of on a scale, a spectrum. There you go.
Right.
In which you kind of fluctuate between the two.
Yeah. And I think one of the major threats that we have through CRT is that of it will end up taking a collectivistic view, but dividing people in tribes based on what they appeal to be their fundamental identity. Again, this idea of losing the transcendent idea of we all being created equal in the image of God, right? Because we're now selective in terms of what is about us, about that one aspect of being made in the image of God. For example, our ethnicity, our culture, if we just appeal to that one aspect, what we end up doing is creating all these small tribes. Mm-hmm. And thereby, it is only going to create more divisiveness than unity. We're not asking for uniformity. I mean, that's not going to happen, but definitely what is it that unifies us? And I think CRT fails to actually offer that. And I think one of the reasons why that is the case is also because there is no clear definition of what oppression means. Oppression according to who, right? Who decides what oppression means like? And not just that. Say if it is on the basis of that if you are a minority, then you automatically seem to be or perceived to be oppressed. If that's the case, when is it that it flips? Is minority the criteria of being oppressed? If that's the case, what happens? Is there a guarantee as to what we are or how we are interpreting and understanding CRT today wouldn't be the case tomorrow when a particular race becomes a minority, which is a majority right now?
All right, Jay, I think you're hitting on something that I also want to extrapolate on, because when we start connecting ideas or views or positions to social groups, and and Josh said this in his own way earlier about these are not truth questions anymore. We're not looking at truth or falsehood. We're connecting positions, views, ideas, propositional statements just to the social groups that make them. Okay? And then in virtue of the status of the social group, that's what grounds the truth value of the view or the statement. I just went back and forth in a relatively charitable discussion with a gentleman on Facebook who said, I really needed to take a look at why 90% of the Black church in America voted for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And I was already referencing Thomas Sowell's book, A Conflict of Interest, and trying to give some evidence and arguments for why it's more reasonable for Christians to be politically conservative than politically liberal, although I made it very clear that being a political conservative or being a political liberal had no determination on one being a Christian, right? I made that very clear. I just said there were better reasons, I thought, for one to be politically conservative. And what he didn't come back necessarily with arguments. He just said, well, 90% of Black people in the evangelical church voted for Hillary Clinton. I think you need to think about that. And I said, okay, I can think about that, but why should an appeal to numbers, which is an informal logical fallacy, compel me to change my view? What if 10 years from now, 90% of Black evangelicals are voting for the Republican candidate in an election? Does that mean, and I'm talking to this interlocutor, does that mean you now have to justify your position for voting for a Democrat instead of a Republican? And I think when I see this kind of thinking where we're not arguing about principles anymore and ideas and how they might be more conducive to either the biblical revelation, but we're just saying how many percentage of this social group believe X, how many percentage of that social group believe Y. And this came up in the New Discourse article that we read, where the author, I think his name was Loveland, was suggesting a different framework for understanding justice from critical social justice. Because when we're just appealing to the numbers of people that believe X, it's like a big logical fallacy.
Yeah.
That keeps getting propagated. And I think I see it in the church. I'm like, well, it's just not an argument.
I think, Logan, you touched on this in another episode that we did, that we need to have a right understanding of what a republic means. We have adopted this notion of democracy as to the majority wins. So I think with regards to moral ideas, and we got to hold on to the transcendence. If not, then we would allow either the minority or the majority to decide what is true and right or good. And that's not how republic works. It is founded on the basis that there is an objective law or truth on the basis of which we have to build a society and work towards that. And that's the notion we have to bring it back, even within the church. You touched on this aspect of revelation. And I think we have abandoned that. And that could be one of the things I would say. If you adopt CRT, you have to ultimately abandon the very notion of revelation as a source of truth.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have the revelation being a form of transcendent
Yeah.
knowledge. But I mean, going back to this, the government thing, I mean, this is why democracies by and large were frowned upon, because if it's just majoritarian rule, they're just so unstable. And when you get down to the 49-51 splits, where each election is now trying to override the next side, this is why democracies don't last very long. It becomes just a mob war between the two, and this is why supermajorities and equal representation, all the things that they're like is anti-democracy. Well, yes, because by and large they're trying to make corrections from this 49-51 split that ultimately emerges in any long-standing democracy, and then the tides back and forth become very vicious and usually break out in some form of armed conflict. But there was something that I think Jacob had said, something that had fallen out of the picture of CRT.
All right, Logan, you were going to say something. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no. And one of the things that I wanted to address was back to what you and Jacob were saying about appeal to numbers. And I think what might be happening isn't just a strict appeal to numbers of the Black church, but actually an appeal to lived experience. And I think this is something that we saw, whatever your views may be of the royal family, the interview with Piers Morgan, where they kind of locked horns on the question, if you know something to be false, objectively false, does that make comments about that also false if it's contrary to the facts? And the individual he was responding to said, no, actually, you have to take into account the lived experience. And Piers Morgan's like, wait a minute, but we know this is false. This didn't happen. These certain claims are made. We were able to verify that they were false. They have to be false. And he said, no, it's lived experience. So I think one thing you lose in adopting CRT and taking on the standpoint view that kind of comes with it is this idea that objective reality tends to be shaky or be able to be overthrown by quote unquote private lived experience.
Yeah, which is the postmodern turn again, which we can get to another time. Josh, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, so there's a host of things, right, that you lose with CRT, and so many of them are central to what it means to be a Christian. You lose forgiveness, you lose, objective reality itself, because it's a postmodern ideology, or as someone would argue, a network of material conditions, depending on how you want to view CRT. But the point is, it does lack in several areas. I would say the main thing that I notice in which it lacks is because, and this goes back to what you were actually saying, Anthony, it really, because it has such a focus on changing the systems and the material structure of society and of the culture, it tends to do that at the expense of personal responsibility. And as a Christian, personal responsibility is huge, because that's the foundation of repentance and the acknowledgement of one's own sin. If you remove that, not only for the Christian believer, but even for that's a stumbling block even for those to come to faith. And I think CRT, because you can have many things in life where you have and both, and things don't need to be mutually exclusive. Sometimes you can have your cake and eat it too, and you can say, hey, systemic oppression is wrong. For example, with the Israelites and the Exodus out of Egypt and all those things. But at the same time, recognize that there is personal responsibility. And so those same Israelites who left were grumbling, and God is like, what are you doing? I just rescued you from this. And so there's both ends of that. And while the Bible embraces both of those, personal responsibility as well as corporate sin, CRT does not. CRT emphasizes ancestral and group guilt, and it says, and it really takes the shift off of the individual. So that, I mean, and there's just so many things that hatch from that are not good, and it prevents repentance of sins. It prevents an acknowledgement of one's own wrongdoing and mistakes, and ultimately, and this is going back to what Jacob was saying, it prevents unification, because it divides between these different groups based off these systems. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Well,
Josh, from a New Testament perspective, I mean, if people are asking if there's an example as to what would Jesus do, and this is what Jesus do, he would not side with a system that oppresses others. I mean, we would agree with that. But when he meets with Zacchaeus, he transforms his life so much that he gives back all that he's taken by force and not by good actions. But then there's one thing we don't see, is that Jesus asking him to leave the system and leave his trade of being a tax collector. I think what he expects of him is that he would go back as a transformed person. He deals with his inner nature, deals with him as an individual, but he expects that he would go back in that very system, be functioning as a transformed person. And I think that's the perspective we are missing when we are purely looking at system as flawed and something we need to change in the system itself.
well,
And
and Josh, you mentioned the sort of move towards what Jacob has pointed out, oftentimes collectivism. This, and you know, that's an age-old problem of the one and the many. We understand that each individual is part of a social group. We are social creatures. But I tell you what, when it comes to claiming victimhood status, is somehow legitimate within the Christian worldview, I would suggest everybody go back to Justin Martyr and read Dialogue with Trifle. I can't remember which paragraph, where the victimization of the Christian is the glory of God. You know, or shortly after that, I think it's Menicius Felix in To Octavius, which is only about a century later. So I don't think we could call these white theologies yet in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, where he says that it is a glorious spectacle to God when the Christian battles with pain. And then that chapter, which I think is chapter 38 in To Octavius, I think maybe everybody who wants to claim victimhood as a Christian maybe needs to read that chapter a couple times. But let's end there. I think we will get a little bit deeper into this question of victimhood and ressentiment or resentment theory in our next episode. And maybe we'll go a little bit more into some theological issues related to critical race theory. But that's all for now. So we will see you next time at the Equal Justice Podcast.